Feral creatures like you belong in a pound, not a palace of law. Those words would eventually become the epitaph of Officer Kalen Zovok's career. Judge Soraya Belrose approached the limestone pillars of the High District Court in a simple linen-wrapped dress, her mahogany leather attaché tucked under her arm. She was mentally rehearsing the opening statements for a complex racketeering trial. "Another gutter runner trying to slip through the side," Zovok muttered. He didn't just block her path, he stepped into her personal space with the weight of a man who owned the sidewalk. When Soraya reached for her security clearance, Zovok didn't wait for an explanation. His palm collided with her cheek, a wet, heavy sound that echoed off the columns. Soraya's head jerked back, her vision blurring into a smear of gray stone and blue sky. The attaché burst open on impact, sending months of meticulous judicial notes fluttering across the concrete like wounded birds. Zovok lunged, his fingers locking around her throat as he pinned her against the cold marble. "I said stay in the dirt where you belong." He wrenched her arms behind her back with a sickening pop of the shoulder, the jagged teeth of the restraints biting deep into her skin. Nearby, Officers Bramwell Ives and Solis Vance, "Wait, let's go with Solis Kynt," didn't intervene. They simply adjusted their body cams to point toward the floor and began a low, rhythmic chuckle. Soraya's jaw burned, but she kept her gaze fixed. 20 feet above the bronze doors, the sun caught the gold leaf lettering, "The Honorable Soraya Belrose, Department 12. Inside the courtroom, the air was conditioned and sterile. Zovok stood at the witness stand, his posture a masterclass in performative humility. He had spent a decade perfecting this, the reasonable officer persona. "Your Honor," Zovok began, nodding toward the bench where Judge Eustace Pendergast sat, a man whose skin looked like crumpled parchment. "I was maintaining the perimeter when I observed a suspicious trespasser attempting to bypass the metal detectors via the restricted staff egress." He pointed a gloved finger at Soraya. She sat at the defendant's table, her face a map of blooming bruises, her silk dress torn at the collar. "The individual was acting with extreme volatility," Zovok continued, his voice smooth as polished glass. "She refused to produce credentials and became physically combative when I attempted a routine field interview. She was dressed, well, quite provocatively for a house of law, and she was carrying a collection of high-level legal documents that appeared to be pilfered." Judge Pendergast leaned over his spectacles. "Pilfered, you say?" "Indeed." She began shouting delusions of grandeur, claiming to hold a high-ranking office. "It's a common tactic, sir. They use the identity gambit to try and intimidate officers of the peace." From the gallery, Ives and Kynt offered somber nods. They were the choir, and Zovok was the preacher. The prosecutor, Isadora Calloway, paced the floor. "Officer Ives, can you confirm the defendant's behavior?" Ives stood, his uniform crisp. "She was a whirlwind of profanity, ma'am." Officer Zovok showed incredible patience. He only used the minimum force necessary to prevent her from breaching the inner sanctum. She actually tripped during her own resistance. That's likely where the facial bruising occurred. Zovok chimed back in, sensing the room was entirely his. "We actually suspect a broader fraud scheme, Your Honor. The documents in her possession featured judicial letterheads. We believe she was planning to impersonate a member of the court to spring a high-value inmate." The irony was a physical weight in the room, suffocating and thick. Soraya remained silent, her spine a straight line of tempered steel. "It's a tragedy, really," Zovok added, casting a look of mock pity toward Soraya. "People like this, they see a system built on merit, and they try to tear it down with accusations of bias the moment they're caught. She didn't want justice, she wanted a free pass. But in this building, the truth actually matters." Zovok leaned back, a small, predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He felt invincible. He had the badge, the brothers in blue, and the ear of the judge. He didn't realize he wasn't standing in a courtroom, he was standing in a trap he had spent the last hour meticulously building for himself. The subject was clearly untethered from reality, Officer Zovok said, casting a pitying look toward Soraya Belrose. "Possibly under the influence of a synthetic narcotic. A less experienced officer might have been forced to use lethal measures. I chose restraint," though my own safety was compromised. Judge Pendergast sighed, a sound like dry autumn leaves. Your professionalism is noted for the record, Officer Zovok. It's a tragedy that our streets and our sanctuaries of law are increasingly plagued by such volatility. At the defendant's table, Soraya sat with a stillness that was almost unnatural. Her hands were folded over the cold metal of the handcuffs. To a casual observer, she looked defeated. But if Zovok had been looking at her eyes instead of her bruises, he would have seen the focused precision of a predator marking a kill zone. She was recording every fabricated detail, every perjury, every smug inflection that would soon act as the fuel for his professional cremation. "Anything else, officer?" Pendergast asked. Zovok straightened his belt, the leather creaking. "Only that this incident is a reminder that some people only respect the law when it's backed by steel." Today, the defendant learned that actions carry consequences. He didn't realize he was narrating his own future. As Zovok stepped down from the stand, he passed Soraya's chair. He leaned in just enough for her to smell his peppermint gum and winked, a sharp, ugly gesture of total conquest. "The defendant may now offer her statement," Pendergast announced, his tone dripping with the boredom of a man expecting a tearful plea for leniency. Soraya stood. The chains between her wrists chimed softly, a metallic percussion that seemed to silence the room. Despite the split lip and the dust on her wrapped dress, she held herself with a terrifying, quiet gravity. "Thank you, Your Honor." Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a bell, clear, resonant, and vibrating with an authority that made the court reporter's head snap up. "I appreciate the opportunity to correct the creative narrative presented by the prosecution." Pendergast blinked. This wasn't the rambling of a gutter runner. "First," Soraya continued, her eyes sweeping the room like a searchlight, "Officer Zovok alleges I was trespassing. However, at 8:47 a.m., I was on a public thoroughfare. I'm sure this court recalls Hague v. CIO, which establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government structures are traditional public forums. My presence there was not only lawful, it was constitutionally protected." The prosecutor, Isadora Calloway, sat up straighter, a frown creasing her brow. This wasn't the script. "Furthermore," Soraya said, gesturing with her bound hands toward the evidence table, "the suspicious documents the officer mentioned are indeed sensitive. They are judicial memoranda and active case files for the High District. Materials I possess not as a thief, but in a specific professional capacity." "And what capacity would that be?" Pendergast interrupted, his voice losing its edge of boredom. Soraya allowed a thin, razor-sharp smile to touch her lips. "I think we'll reach my curriculum vitae shortly, Your Honor. For now, let's discuss the malfunctioning body cameras." Zovok felt a cold bead of sweat track down his spine. The confidence that had filled his chest like a balloon began to leak. "Officer Zovok claims his equipment failed," Soraya said, her voice dropping into a lower, more dangerous register. "However, under Federal Rule of Evidence 106, I am entitled to the introduction of the full record. This courthouse is equipped with high-fidelity perimeter surveillance every 15 feet. Additionally, the county server automatically archives body cam streams the moment a struggle is detected, regardless of whether the officer deactivates the local unit." She turned her gaze to Zovok, who looked suddenly smaller in his uniform. "I am formally requesting a preservation order for all electronic data from 8:45 a.m. to 9:05 a.m. That includes the mobile phone footage currently stored on the personal devices of Officers Ives and KYNT, who I observed recording the assault for their own amusement." "Objection!" Calloway shouted, though her voice lacked conviction. "The defendant cannot make evidentiary demands without counsel." Soraya turned on the prosecutor with the speed of a viper. "As a pro-SE defendant, I am exercising my Sixth Amendment right to present a defense. And under Brady v. Maryland, you have an affirmative obligation to preserve exculpatory evidence. Unless, of course, the prosecution is suggesting that the truth is prejudicial to their case." The silence that followed was deafening. In the back of the room, Vigo Rask, a bailiff who had been with the court for 15 years, went pale. He leaned forward, squinting at the woman in the bruised skin and the torn dress. His eyes went wide. Officer Zovak testified that I claimed to be someone important, Soraya said, her voice now a calm, lethal staccato. I made no such claim. I merely attempted to present my identification, which he struck from my hand before initiating a physical assault. She reached slowly into her pocket, her movements deliberate. I have in my possession documentation that will establish exactly why I was at this courthouse this morning. Specifically, why I was scheduled to be on the other side of that bench at 9 a.m. sharp. My judicial parking permit, issued by the High District Administration. My biometric access card, coded for the private elevator and the level 4 chambers. And, of course, my official commission. Soraya held up a midnight blue leather wallet. As she flicked it open, the gold-embossed seal of the High District Court caught the fluorescent light, gleaming like a predatory eye. The bailiff, Vigo Rask, didn't just move, he nearly fell backward. He had seen that face every morning for 3 years. He had held doors for her. He had brought her espresso. He looked at the bruised woman in the handcuffs and then at the face on the ID. Your Honor, Soraya said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying calm. I believe there has been a profound failure in identification. Perhaps a recess is in order so the court can verify exactly whose throat Officer Zovak was squeezing this morning. Judge Pendergast stared at the badge, his mouth working silently like a fish out of water. He looked at Rask, who was nodding with a frantic, horrified intensity. Court is in recess. 15 minutes, Pendergast managed to choke out. As the gavel tapped weakly, Zovak felt the floor tilt. He looked at Soraya, expecting to see the gutter runner he had mocked. Instead, he saw a woman whose silence was now louder than his lies. The game hadn't just changed, the board had been flipped. In the small, sterile holding room behind the bench, the silence was broken only by the frantic jingle of Rask's keys. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped them twice before finding the right one to unlock Soraya's restraints. Judge Belrose, Rask whispered, his voice cracking. Merciful stars, Judge. I didn't know. In the civilian clothes with the... I am so sorry. It's not your apology I'm interested in, Vigo, Soraya said, rubbing the deep red welts on her wrists. But I need you to go to my chambers. Quietly. Do not speak to the press or the other officers. Bring me my obsidian robes, the ones with the silver braiding. And Vigo. The bailiff paused at the door. Bring the onyx gavel. The heavy one. Rask vanished. Soraya reached for her personal phone, which had been returned to her by a trembling court clerk. It was blowing up. 52 messages from her lead clerk, Zan the Prin. Judge, where are you? The Vane trial is in 10 minutes. The defense is asking for a delay. Soraya typed back, reschedule Vane. Something of constitutional significance has taken priority. Clear the rest of the week. Then, she dialed a number she rarely used outside of emergencies, Chief Judge Morella Dax. Morella? It's Soraya. I need an immediate preservation order for every scrap of digital data in this building from 8:45 to 9:15. No, don't ask yet. Just do it. And Morella. I want a full audit of every arrest made by a Kalen Zovak in the last 5 years. Every single one. There was a long pause on the other end. Soraya, what happened? I was told today that animals like me belong in cages, Morella. It's time to show this precinct that the cage has 2 sides. Rask returned with a garment bag. As Soraya unzipped it, the heavy silk of the judicial robes spilled out like a dark tide. She stepped into them, the fabric settling on her shoulders with the familiar, weighted gravity of her office. She adjusted the silver-braided collar, making sure it sat perfectly. She picked up the onyx gavel. Engraved on the head in silver script were the words, "Truth is the only sanctuary." The bruise on her cheek was a dark violet now, stark against her skin, but she didn't cover it with makeup. She wanted them to see it. She wanted it to be the last thing Zovak saw before his world ended. Vigo, she said, standing at her full, imposing height. When we go back in there, I want the full announcement. No shortcuts. Yes, Your Honor. The heavy oak doors to the courtroom swung open. Rask's voice didn't just announce, it roared, vibrating the very glass in the windows. All rise. The High District Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Soraya Belrose presiding. The sound hit the room like a physical shockwave. Officer Zovok, who had been leaning smugly against the rail, went bone white. His knees actually buckled. Judge Pendergast scrambled out of the chair, nearly tripping over his own feet as he retreated to the gallery. Soraya entered. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like a defendant. She looked like a storm draped in silk. She took her seat behind the elevated bench, the height giving her a literal and metaphorical view of the wreckage below. She looked down at Zovok. Then, she slowly raised the onyx gavel and brought it down with a crack that sounded like a bone breaking. "Officer Zovok," she said, her voice a lethal silk. "I believe you were in the middle of a fairy tale. Please, do continue." The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed the air from the lungs of everyone present. Soraya took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat down with a slow, agonizing deliberation. Her eyes, dark and sharp as flint, swept the courtroom. She catalogued every slack jaw, every trembling hand, and the dawning horror on the faces of those who finally realized they had been complicit in a high-speed collision with a brick wall of their own making. "Officer Zovok," she said, her voice a low, melodic chime that carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. "You may remain standing." Zovok looked as if he were trying to dissolve into the floorboards. His face had cycled through every shade of sickly gray in the span of a minute. "Your Honor," Judge Pendergast stammered, his parchment-thin skin flushing a blotchy red as he stood. I mean to say." Judge Pendergast, Soraya interrupted, her tone crisp and cold. "Thank you for holding the fort during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket immediately. I will take it from here." Pendergast didn't wait for a second invitation. He practically bolted from the courtroom, his robes fluttering behind him like the wings of a frightened crow. Soraya turned her full, undivided attention back to Zovok, who was now visibly vibrating. "Officer Zovok, roughly 2 hours ago, you stood on that witness stand and gave testimony under oath. Do you recall the specifics of your narrative?" I. Zovok's throat clicked, but no more words came out. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Soraya continued, her gaze never wavering. "You stated, and I quote, 'These people always claim to be someone important to avoid accountability.' Do you recall that particular insight?" Zovok nodded, a jerky, mechanical movement. "You also referred to me as a provocative gutter runner and claimed you had seen this identity gambit many times before. Is that an accurate summary?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the overhead vents sounded like a jet engine. And perhaps most memorably, Soraya's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "You stated that people like me need to learn that actions carry consequences. Do you remember that specific piece of wisdom, officer?" Zovok's knees shook so violently his duty belt rattled. Soraya reached beneath her bench and pulled out a sleek tablet. "Officer Zovok, I'd like to introduce a piece of evidence that has just been brought to the court's attention." She turned the screen toward the room. It was high-definition security footage from the courthouse's external perimeter. "This is Camera 7, which provides a panoramic, unobstructed view of the main pillars." Her finger tapped the screen, and the video began to play. The gallery watched in stunned silence. There was Soraya, walking with purpose toward the entrance. There was Zovok, stepping out like a predator. Then, his voice, vile and dripping with contempt, blared through the courtroom speakers, another gutter spawn trying to slip through the side. Gasps erupted. The video showed the unprovoked strike, the way Soraya's head snapped sideways, and the brutal grip on her throat. But the killing blow was yet to come. "Feral creatures like you belong in a pound, not a palace of law." Zovok's own words, recorded with crystal clarity, echoed off the high ceilings. Several court staffers turned away in disgust. "Officer Zovok," Soraya said, pausing the frame on his sneering face. "Do you see any volatility in the defendant? Any profanity? Any resistance?" Zovok remained silent, his career disintegrating in real time. Now, Soraya continued, swiping to a new file. "Let's address the matter of your malfunctioning body camera." This is the backup footage automatically synced to the High District cloud every 60 seconds, a protocol I helped implement 3 years ago, which you apparently overlooked. The new video began, and Zovok's voice filled the room again, but this time, it was worse. It was the unedited soundtrack of a conspiracy. "Look at this one, thinking she can just walk into my house," Zovok's recorded voice snarled. "Time to teach her which side of the cage she belongs on." The prosecutor, Isadora Calloway, was frantically shoving files into her briefcase, her eyes darting toward the exit. But Soraya wasn't finished. "Officer Ives." "Officer KYNT," she called out. Both men looked as if they were trying to turn invisible. "You both testified that Officer Zovok handled the situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to revise that statement before I refer this matter to the State Bar?" She advanced the video to show the perspective from their own cameras. Their laughter, the mocking, cruel sound of it as they watched their colleague brutalize a woman, filled the silence like a poison. "Officer Zovok," Soraya said, setting the tablet down with a sharp thud. "You asked me for employment verification earlier. Well, here it is." She gestured to the bronze seal behind her, then to the nameplate on the bench, then toward the grand oil portrait in the foyer that bore her likeness. "I have been the presiding judge of this district for over a decade. Every warrant you've signed, every arrest you've made, every heroic story you've told in this jurisdiction has happened under the umbrella of my authority." Zovok finally found his voice, though it was a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. "Your Honor. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Soraya repeated, her voice dripping with irony. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a woman who didn't fit your definition of power, and you decided to destroy her because you thought you could. But there is one more thing you didn't know." The courtroom held its breath. "For the last 6 months, I have been collaborating with the Bureau of Civil Rights to investigate a pattern of systemic bias and falsified testimony within your precinct. This morning wasn't a random encounter, Officer Zovok. You've been under a microscope for months, and today, you handed us the most perfect piece of evidence we could have hoped for." She lifted the onyx gavel, its weight catching the light. "Officer Zovok, you were right about one thing. Actions do carry consequences. And yours are about to be catastrophic." The gavel came down with a sound like a thunderclap, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of a reckoning. The courtroom was no longer a place of routine procedure, it had become an arena of reckoning. Kalen Zovok didn't just sit, he crumpled into the defendant's chair, his posture leaking the last of his manufactured bravado. The news had rippled through the high district halls like a seismic event. The gallery was now a wall of faces, stenographers, rival attorneys, and even the janitorial staff, all held in a breathless, collective hush. They were here to witness the most spectacular collapse in the building's history. Besides Zovok, his hastily summoned lawyer, Balthazar Cross, looked like a man trying to extinguish a forest fire with a water pistol. He kept adjusting his tie, his eyes darting toward the bench where Soraya Belrose sat, a silhouette of obsidian silk and righteous fury. "Officer Zovok," Soraya began, her voice resonating with the clarity of a church bell in a graveyard. "Before the gavel falls on the criminal charges you have earned today, I believe it is necessary to clarify exactly whose dignity you attempted to strip away on those steps." She stood, moving around the bench to stand on the floor of the well, closing the distance between herself and the man who had choked her. "My name is Judge Soraya Belrose. I was appointed to this seat over 20 years ago, confirmed by a unanimous vote of the High Council. I graduated summa cum laude from Yale, where I served as the first Black woman to lead the law review." She took a step closer. Zovok's attorneys stopped breathing. "Before I donned these robes, I spent a decade as a senior litigator for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. My specialty was the prosecution of institutional rot. I have successfully sent 47 law enforcement officers to federal prison for the very brand of ego-driven brutality you displayed this morning." She paused, letting the number 47 echo. It wasn't just a statistic, it was a body count of careers she had ended for the sake of justice. "In my tenure on this bench, I have presided over 15,000 cases. I have looked into the eyes of murderers, saints, and everyone in between. But in all that time, officer, I have never encountered a more perfect specimen of the malignancy currently killing the public's trust in the badge. Soraya returned to her seat and opened a heavy, leather-bound dossier. The sound of the paper turning was the only noise in the room. We have spent the last hour reviewing your history. It is illuminating. You have testified in this building 43 times over the last 5 years. You stood exactly where you are now and swore to the truth 43 times. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. A statistical analysis of your arrests reveals a hauntingly consistent rhythm. 28 of those 43 cases involved defendants of color. In 26 of those instances, you were the primary arresting officer. In 100% of those reports, you used the exact same phrases you use today. Subject was erratic, refused to comply, threatened officer safety. She snapped the file shut. The sound was like a gunshot. You had a script, Kaylin. You thought that if you used the right magic words, the system would protect you. You thought the robes would always side with the badge. But you forgot one thing. I am the one who wears the robes. The air in the room felt electrified. Zovak was no longer white. He was a bruised shade of gray, his hands trembling so violently they tapped against the mahogany table. You asked me this morning if I knew my place, Soraya said, her voice dropping to a whisper that traveled to the very back of the room. You told me I belonged in a cage. You called me a feral creature on the steps of the building I have sworn to protect. She picked up the onyx gavel, holding it aloft like a weapon. Let me define my place for you, once and for all. My place is here, at the apex of the law, ensuring that the power we lend to men like you isn't used to hunt the people you're paid to serve. My place is being the wall that stops people like you from turning this city into a private playground for your prejudices. She looked down at him, her gaze finally settling on the Zovak nameplate on his chest. You didn't just assault a woman today. You assaulted the very concept of the rule of law. And as for your cage, crack. The gavel hit the sounding block. The noise was final. It was the sound of a prison door closing. Officer Zovak, you are hereby remanded into the custody of the Bureau of Civil Rights. You are being charged with felony assault of a judicial officer, perjury, and civil rights violations under color of law. Officers Ives and Kwanti, you are to be disarmed and detained as accomplices after the fact. As federal agents entered through the rear doors, men and women Soraya had called personally during the recess, Zovak finally looked up. For the first time, he saw not a gutter runner, but the full, terrifying majesty of the justice he had tried to bury. Take them, Soraya commanded. They've had their turn on the stairs. Now, they can see what the view looks like from the inside of the cage. Balthazar Cross, Zovak's attorney, leaned in to whisper frantically in his client's ear, but Zovak seemed paralyzed, a ghost trapped in his own body. 47 complaints, Soraya repeated, letting the number hang in the absolute stillness of the room. That averages to more than 3 formal grievances every single year of your employment. Soraya pulled a thick, brass-fastened document from the dossier and held it up. Let's begin with grievance number 1, filed in 2009. Mrs. Alara Voss, a 63-year-old grandmother. She alleged that during a routine traffic stop, you used a racial slur and slammed her face into the hood of her sedan simply because she asked for your badge number. The packed gallery stirred, a collective, uneasy rustle of fabric and indrawn breath. Internal Affairs concluded that Mrs. Voss's allegations were unsubstantiated, Soraya noted, her voice dripping with glacial irony. Fascinating, considering we just watched high-definition video of you utilizing those exact same tactics and vocabulary on me. She flipped a page. Complaint 12. 2012. Kenzo Eris, a 17-year-old honors student. He alleged you planted narcotics in his backpack after he refused to act as an informant against his older brother. Once again, unsubstantiated. Zovak's breathing was audible now, a wet, shallow rasp. Complaint 23. 2016. Dr. Thaddeus Loxley. Soraya looked up, making sure Zovak met her eyes. Yes, Dr. Loxley. The chief of cardiology at High District General. He alleged you arrested him in the driveway of his own estate because you refused to believe a man of his complexion could reside in that zip code. He spent 6 hours in a holding cell before his legal counsel could intervene. Soraya tilted her head. Do you recall the department's finding on that complaint, Officer Zovok? I don't. Zovok's voice was a microscopic croak. Unsubstantiated, Soraya answered for him. Are we beginning to identify the pattern? In the front row of the gallery, Chief Judge Morella Dax had quietly slipped into a seat. Her expression was carved from stone, a legal pad balanced on her knee as she took meticulous notes. But here is what elevates these tragedies from a series of unfortunate incidents into a federal investigation, Soraya continued. I have cross-referenced your complaint history with your arrest logs. The mathematics are undeniable. She gestured to her lead clerk, who wheeled out a large, starkly printed schematic on an easel. Over 15 years, you have logged exactly 1,089 arrests. She activated a laser pointer, the red dot resting on a massive red bar graph. Targeting. Of those 1,089 arrests, 87% involved citizens of color. This is despite your patrol sector's demographics being 42% white, 31% Hispanic, and 27% Black. Use of force. Your own reports indicate you deployed physical force in 63% of your encounters with minority suspects, compared to a mere 12% when arresting white individuals. The dismissal rate, most damning of all, 432 of your minority arrests were thrown out of court due to lack of evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, or blatant constitutional violations. A failure rate of nearly 40%. Soraya deactivated the pointer. Do you know what the Department of Justice calls an officer with a 40% constitutional violation rate, Kaylin? We call it a criminal enterprise. The scratching of reporters' pens in the gallery sounded like a swarm of locusts. And let us not forget the financial toll, Soraya added, pulling one last sheet from the file. Over the past 15 years, this city's taxpayers have paid out $2.3 million in silent settlements to bury your conduct. You have cost this city more than the annual budget of our public libraries. Zovok finally forced a complete sentence past his lips, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic defense. Your Honor, I was just doing my job. Your job. Soraya's voice cracked like a whip, instantly silencing him. She reached beneath her bench and produced a heavy, embossed piece of parchment. Let me read you the oath you swore when you pinned that badge to your chest. She held the document aloft and read, her voice vibrating with reverence for the words and disgust for the man who had broken them. I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office. So help me God. She set the parchment down gently. Faithfully and impartially, Officer Zovok. Not selectively. Not based on the melanin of the citizen in front of you. Not based on your own venomous prejudices. Soraya walked around the bench again, turning to address the sea of faces in the gallery, the lawyers, the clerks, the citizens who had been brutalized in the dark for far too long. What we are witnessing today is not the anomaly of a single rogue officer. It is the inevitable rot of a system that shields men like Zovok. A system that rubber stamps complaint after complaint, signs settlement after settlement, and looks the other way while the vulnerable pay the price. She turned back to Zovok, looking down at him from the steps of the bench. But that system finally failed you today, didn't it? Because today, blinded by your own arrogance, you chose to assault the one person who possessed the power, the resources, and the jurisdiction to burn your sanctuary to the ground. Zovok buried his face in his hands, a broken, trembling shell of the predator he had been 2 hours prior. You spent this morning telling me I needed to learn my place, Soraya said, returning to her high-backed leather chair. She picked up the onyx gavel. Your place, Officer Zovok, is at the defense table, facing the full, terrifying weight of a 15-year criminal reckoning. Crack. The sound of the gavel was absolute. And that, Soraya whispered into the profound silence, is exactly where you are going to stay. She stood tall behind her bench, her obsidian robes flowing around her like armor forged from the very concept of justice. She looked out at the gallery, preparing to deliver a verdict that would echo in the halls of the High District for generations. Before I formally refer this matter to the federal prosecutors, she announced, her voice carrying the accumulated weight of centuries of jurisprudence, I want to answer a question for this city. What happens when a man with a badge believes he is a god? What happens when a decade of unchecked supremacy convinces him he can choke a federal judge on the steps of her own court and walk away? Zovak couldn't look up. He was already a ghost. For 15 years, you have treated this city as your personal hunting ground, Soraya declared, the onyx gavel resting heavily in her hand. You thought you were asserting your dominance over just another powerless victim. Soraya leaned forward, her elbows resting on the polished mahogany. When she spoke next, her voice dropped to a razor-thin whisper, forcing every person in the gallery to hold their breath and lean in to hear her. But I was never powerless, Kaylin. And neither were the citizens you have terrorized for a decade and a half. The only difference is that today, justice finally had a front-row seat. She straightened, her obsidian robes settling around her. Based on the indisputable evidence presented in this chamber, evidence generated by your own hands, your own mouth, and your own equipment, I am holding you in direct, unbailable criminal contempt of this court. The words struck the room like physical blows. Furthermore, as a sitting federal magistrate, I am formally binding you over to the Bureau of Civil Rights. You are facing charges of first-degree assault, assault on a judicial officer, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and first-degree perjury. Beside him, Balthazar Cross closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands. With each felony listed, Zovak seemed to physically shrink, the swagger completely hollowed out of him. But Kaylin, do not flatter yourself by thinking this reckoning is just about you, Soraya said, turning her gaze to the packed gallery. You are merely a symptom of a much deeper rot. For too long, the machinery of law has operated with a willful blindness to impunity. We have dismissed the grievances of the marginalized, buried the evidence of the brutalized, and paid quiet settlements while leaving the predators on the streets. Her voice rose, resonating with a fierce, unwavering passion. We have told the victims of men like you that their pain is a necessary byproduct of order. But that era of complicity ends today. In this room, we prove that the law is not a shield for the corrupt. No one, not a patrolman, not a prosecutor, not a judge, is above it. Suddenly, the dam broke. Zovak collapsed over the defense table, his body racked with loud, ugly sobs that echoed pathetically through the grand chamber. I'm sorry, he wept, the sound muffled by his hands. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant. Soraya looked down at him, her expression devoid of pity. It was the cold, clinical look of a surgeon observing an excised tumor. Your apology is 15 years and 47 complaints too late, officer, she said, her voice turning to ice. Your remorse is a product of your captivity, not your conscience. You are only crying because you finally put your hands on someone who could strike back. She lifted the onyx gavel high above her head. In your final moments as a man permitted to walk freely in polite society, I want you to understand something. Every grandmother you demeaned, every student you framed, every doctor you humiliated, they all deserve the exact same vengeance I am delivering right now. Today, I do not just speak for myself. I speak for the 432 voices you silenced. She glared down at the broken man. You told me to know my place. My place is ensuring that monsters like you never again use a badge to swallow innocent lives. Crack. The gavel came down like a thunderbolt. You are remanded to federal custody without bail, where you will await a trial that will inevitably end in a maximum sentence of 25 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, I am initiating a sweeping federal audit into every arrest you have ever made. The victims you buried will have their day in the light. Soraya set the gavel down. Justice may wear a blindfold, Officer Zovak, but she hears every cry in the dark. And eventually, she comes for everyone. For a moment, there was nothing but Zovak's weeping. And then, starting from the back row and rolling forward like a tidal wave, the courtroom erupted. The applause was deafening, a 5-minute standing ovation from a city that had finally been heard. 6 months later, the aftershocks of that single morning had fundamentally rewired the architecture of the city's justice system. Kaylin Zovak was an inmate in a federal penitentiary. Stripped of his badge, his pension, and his freedom, he spent his days in solitary protective custody, the only way to keep him safe from the very populations he had spent his life targeting. The man who had mocked the concept of cages now lived in a 6x9 concrete box, fully acquainted with powerlessness. But his downfall was merely the match that lit the powder keg. The federal audit ordered by Soraya uncovered a sprawling, systemic network of corruption. 12 officers were stripped of their badges. 4 precinct supervisors were indicted on federal racketeering charges. The entire police department was placed under a strict federal consent decree. Chief Judge Morella Dax instituted sweeping reforms. Cloud-synced, tamper-proof body cameras became a mandatory condition of employment. The 432 cases tainted by Zovak were entirely reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals walked free, and the city was forced to pay out an $8.7 million restitution fund, money drawn directly from the police department's pension and operating budget. Officers Ives and KYNT, the men who had laughed on the steps, were terminated and indicted for conspiracy. The audio of their laughter during the assault was stripped from their cameras and is now mandatory listening in ethics seminars at police academies nationwide. The young clerk who had first recognized Soraya in the gallery, Zan the Prin, resigned her clerkship to join the Civil Liberties Defense Union, dedicating her career to hunting down the remaining Zovaks of the world. As for Judge Soraya Belrose, she became an icon. She declined media interviews, choosing instead to write the curriculum for constitutional accountability that is now taught in law schools across the country. The limestone building where it all happened underwent a subtle change. Above the bronze doors where Zovak had made his final, fatal mistake, a new plaque was installed beneath the sun. It bore a simple inscription. Here, the truth found its sanctuary. Officer Martinez sits in his prison cell, probably thinking about the moment he chose to assault a woman because he thought she was powerless. He thought he knew his place in the world. He thought he knew hers. He was wrong about both because sometimes justice doesn't just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. Sometimes justice carries a gavel. And sometimes when the moment is right, justice hits back. Never underestimate the power of standing up to bullies. Share this story if you believe everyone deserves justice, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories of courage triumphing over corruption, and subscribe because justice stories like this happen every day and everyone deserves to see them. Your story could be next. The viral video of Judge Belrose delivering her final decree didn't just trend, it became a digital monument. Within a week, it became the most watched courtroom footage in history, surpassed only by the weight of the 50 million lives it touched. Comments flooded in from every corner of the globe, from people who had lived through their own shadows of injustice, people who had spent a lifetime waiting for a moment where accountability was delivered with such absolute, surgical precision. Today, Kalen Zovak sits in a federal cell, the silence of the prison yard likely echoing with the phantom sound of that onyx gavel. He had walked onto those courthouse steps thinking he understood the hierarchy of the world. He thought he knew exactly who was meant to be in a cage and who was meant to hold the key. He was wrong. He failed to realize that justice isn't just a statue on a pedestal or a set of rules in a dusty book. Sometimes, justice wears obsidian silk robes. Sometimes, justice carries a gavel carved from stone. And sometimes, when the arrogance of a bully reaches its peak, justice doesn't just watch, she hits back. Never underestimate the power of a single person standing in the light. Share this story if you believe that the law should be a shield for the many, not a weapon for the few. If you want to see a world where courage systematically dismantles corruption, hit that like button. Subscribe to keep the light burning, because stories like this happen in the dark every day, and they deserve to be told. Your voice could be the next one to change the world.